personally, a marvelous scientist by the name of Anton Zeilinger. He, drawing on the work of John Wheeler, relating to work of Stephen Hawking, he suggests, it's a long quote, but it's pretty juicy, so allow me if you will. He's suggesting something else is underlying, not particles and forces, something deeper. He says, one may be tempted to assume that whenever we ask questions of nature, of the world there outside, there is reality existing independently of what can be said about it. This is an unquestioned assumption in Sean Carroll's book. He said, we may be tempted to, we, Anton Zeilinger, John Wheeler, and others will say, we now claim that such a position is void of any meaning. It's not even wrong. It just doesn't mean anything. It is obvious that any property or feature of reality out there, so to speak, can only be based on information we receive. There cannot be any statement whatsoever about the world or about reality that is not based on such information. It therefore follows that the concept of reality, without at least the ability in principle to make statements about it, to obtain information about its features, is devoid of any possibility of confirmation or proof. This implies that the distinction between information, that is knowledge, and reality is devoid of meaning. Evidently, what we are talking about is, again, a unification of very different concepts. The reader might recall that unification is one of the main themes of the development of modern science. So John Wheeler really unpacks this in a tremendously interesting, provocative way, that information, semantic information, meaningful information, is fundamental, underlying, and out of our concepts of information, we create the constructs of particles, forces, space, time, matter, subject, object, mind, and matter, and so on. Information is underlying, information is primary. It's a different view. But then there's another theoretical physicist, first rate, right up here at Stanford, André Linde. He suggests another possibility of what's underlying. He writes, and I quote him, "The current scientific model of the material world obeying laws of physics, which Sean has just described, has been so successful that we forget about our starting point as conscious observers and conclude that matter is the only reality and that perceptions are only helpful for describing it. But in fact, we are substituting the reality of our experience of the universe with a conceptually contrived belief in an independently existent material world." And he poses a question, a heretical question perhaps, and that is it possible that consciousness, like space-time, has its own intrinsic degrees of freedom, and that neglecting these will lead to a description of the universe that is fundamentally incomplete? So the core theory may be incomplete after all because something's left out, and that's consciousness. We have not understood it. What if our perceptions, he continues, are as real, or maybe in a certain sense are even more real than material objects? What if consciousness is more real, more fundamental, more underlying than particles and forces? This is, again, not by some mystic or hippie, as much as I like hippies, but a first-rate cosmologist. I'm sure Sean knows him personally. But then there's another view. And again, I'm citing only top-notch physicists. Freeman Dyson, he writes, "I'm reluctant to engage in discussions about the meaning of quantum theory because I find that the experts in this area have a tendency to speak with dogmatic certainty, each of them convinced that one particular solution to the problem has a unique claim to be the final truth. As a physicist, I am much more impressed by our ignorance than by our knowledge." In that theme, I will quote my two colleagues right here. Sean Carroll, "Quantum mechanics is the deepest and most fundamental picture of the world we now have, but what it says about reality is utterly uncertain." But he's certainly certain that it's the best show in town. He's a physicist. And Marcelo Gleiser, "We are essentially," and I quote, "we are essentially blind to what exists at the very core of physical reality. All we have is our measurements, and they give an incomplete picture of what's really going on." So, I was invited